Welcome, everybody. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes and then we'll get started.
Fantastic. And we're all good on the screen share?
Yes, looking good. Welcome, everybody. I think we'll give it 30 more seconds and we'll get going. Okay, I guess I'll crack on now. So thank you for coming, everyone. I'm your host for today. I'm Saskia, and if you hop to the next slide, if that's all right. Yeah, I'm Saskia. I'm the head of experimentation strategy, and I head up our team of consultants and strategists in the UK for the Conversion Agency. I've been at Conversion for about 5 years now, so I've been really lucky to get to see a lot of the journey that we've had in terms of the Lever framework. It's gone through many iterations, and there's been a huge effort that's gone into getting it where it is today. I'm going to hand you over to Ed shortly. He's a consultant at Conversion, and he's been hugely instrumental in developing the Lever framework into one of our most powerful tools. So he's going to be the perfect person to take you through the content today. And I know everyone's probably itching to get into the session, so I'll just really quickly set the scene for today before I hand you over to Ed. So in terms of today's session, you may have seen the white paper for the Lever framework that we produced, which covers the theory of the framework essentially. And that's not what we're going to replay today. Today it's going to be a lot more practical, so talking to you about how you can actually apply the framework in your programs in a practical way. So on the next slide, you'll see in today's session, we're going to cover how to apply the Lever framework at every one of these key stages. So a lot of you will probably recognize these key stages in the strategic process for experimentation. So research, insights, ideation, experimentation analysis, and then meta-analysis. We're going to show you how you can apply the framework at every one of these stages. And if you have any questions throughout the session today, then please ask them in the comments, and we'll make sure to leave time at the end to try and answer as many as we can. So a few final words before we get started. I just wanted to talk to you about, before we sort of dig in, how the Lever framework's been so important in terms of many of our proudest achievements at Conversion. So for example, many of the most exciting brands have chosen Conversion as their experimentation agency. Some of the logos of those clients are on the left, and there's many more as well. So we've been, incredibly lucky to go on those journeys with those clients, and a lot of that is down to the Lever framework. It's one of the most critical things that sets us apart. We've also made a lot of major advancements in our approach to experimentation strategy, and some of those we're going to take you through today, including things like our recent developments to our prioritization approach, using artificial intelligence to inform prioritization of our experiments. And we've also hit our highest annual win rate ever this year. And again, that's the Lever framework has been critical to that in informing our strategies. So I couldn't be prouder of Ed and the team for all of the efforts that they've put in over the years that have got us to this point. And to see that those kind of achievements come off the back of it has been really exciting. So yeah, can't wait for Ed to take you guys through that now. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Ed.
Thank you very much. Fantastic. So I think the best place to start before we get into more of the nitty-gritty of how we're using this day to day in a bit more practical detail to help you in your efforts to start using and benefiting from this framework. It's good to have a really clear, strong intuition on what exactly levers are and what it is they're trying to do, the role that they're playing in our strategy, and really in the way that we think about CRO and the concepts that we use. A nice way to do this is to take a really simple experiment. It's an adapted toy version of a real experiment that was run, probably a very familiar kind of change to a lot of you. So on the left-hand side, we have the top hero section of a homepage for a subscription company. And on the right-hand side, you can see an amended version of this page where we've added the Trustpilot logo along with the good Trustpilot rating. This is a third-party reviews platform that's very popular in the UK. And yeah, you can see there that it's been applied with various bits of information really to give some reassurances to those users. In the control, you can see an 8% conversion rate, and in the variation, a 10% conversion rate. Let's say, for the sake of argument, and indeed it was true in this case, fortunately, that we've met our statistical criteria. So we're going to go ahead and implement this experience. We are very confident that it's going to add revenue on this page. The question becomes, well, what else can we learn from this? What else can we take from it that's going to inform later experiments, other experiments that we might want to run, so we can go beyond simply knowing that we should implement this experience? Now, there's one, I guess, kind of naive, explicit learning that you might apply to this, which is really just a description of the execution, right? The default hypothesis we need to validate in order to implement it. We added a Trustpilot logo with a copy excellent rating with 1,089 reviews to the homepage of this website, and it increased the conversion rate. But of course, we want to go further than that. We want to generate evidence for the kinds of claims that can help us know more about what to do next, rather than what it is we did in this one-off experiment. And there are all kinds of things we might consider that we might want to leverage from this winning experiment. It's a substantial winner. It shows a lot of promise. What else can we do based on this? We could ask questions like, is Trustpilot itself an effective thing to show to users on this site? Perhaps on landing pages of this site specifically, or actually landing pages generally. Is trust important on the homepage? Important across this site? Is it important in this industry? Is boosting trust critical for CRO generally, for subscription companies, and so on? There are so many ways that you could reinterpret this experiment, so many kinds of things that you might bring it to bear as evidence that it's relevant to. This is really where levers come in. Levers are all about trying to give us a conceptual level to go over and above individual executions, to start describing something meaningful about the independent variable, what it is we're changing in an experiment, something that's going to carry across experiments. We think of it as a feature of a user's experience or mindset which influences the user behavior. So a real focus there on the mentality of the user and how we can leverage that. As I say, it's designed to help us collect learnings beyond any one execution. It sits over and above the specific details of any one experiment, and is designed to carry learnings from multiple experiments and bigger picture claims that we're going to want to make and that we're going to want to benefit from in our ideation processes. They're defined in a way where data collected about any one-page flow, website, or even industry can inform decision-making in other contexts. And we'll see later on how we've used that not just to inform the prioritization strategy within individual programs, but how we collect data from experiments run across our client base to build up a large database that can generate really interesting industry-level insights and really give you a head start before you even have research that may be meaningfully informing you in your specific site context. So back to this question of what we might learn from an experiment, and specifically the question of what we learn over and above the default hypothesis of really describing the implementation and the fact that it was a successful experiment. Well, one kind of practical thing we might take away from this, which sits just below the lever level, a little more specific, would be that adding Trustpilot assurances across the site has a high probability of increasing the conversion rate. I think this is probably a pretty intuitive thing that people might carry away from it. You know, where else can we apply this on the site? And this is good and it operates over more than one experiment, but you can see intuitively, I think, how it has limits in terms of the number of implementations, executions of experiments that it's likely to be able to support. It may not be relevant on all those pages, and talking about it again and again may not be that powerful. So this is really where the levers framework gives us a little bit more breadth in the kind of inferences we can make, starting with our most specific description of this experiment under the levers framework, which would be that showing social proof is an effective way of increasing the conversion rate. That is, appeals to people like you as the customer, other people who have had good experiences with the product or service as a means to persuade you that it's a viable service, to reassure you in terms of the trust that might be there. Sitting just above social proof, we have the idea of credibility. So overall, how reliable and competent do you seem as a service? To what extent do users feel like they should believe the kinds of claims you're making about the virtues of your product on the site? And at the greatest scope, the broadest category we might use to interpret this experiment, we talk about trust more generally. Helping users to trust our company is likely to increase their conversion rate. Now, we don't know that these statements are true. They're not as directly evidenced and as conclusively evidenced with the, that more precisely calculable level of statistical error that will be implied by that experiment. Instead, they're broader claims that are going to require multiple experiments in order to be validated, in order for us to find strong evidence for or against those claims. And the lever framework is all about helping us group together experiments in order to learn at this higher level in the long term. So let's look a little bit more closely at these lever level claims. If we're thinking about a claim like showing social proof as an effective way of increasing the conversion rate on this site even, but particularly if we wanted to broaden it out to be about the industry or about CRO more broadly, we need to run multiple social proof experiments in order to increase our confidence in this learning. And it's going to be much easier to observe patterns like this with a consistent structured tagging framework. We want a common vocabulary, a common system of concepts that can allow us over time and even between different practitioners and programs to accumulate relevant data. So the idea of social proof here from the levers framework is also going to invite you to consider a broader suite of possible solutions than you might think of if you took the overly narrow view of this is just about Trustpilot. It would invite you to consider, for example, things like testimonials, more detailed reviews, and customer statistics, like how many happy customers you have, how many customers you have overall, and so on. When we move then up one level to the level of credibility, again, we're redescribing this experiment and its independent variable. We're talking about an even broader claim, and one which is going to incorporate as relevant evidence experiments that are related to social proof, but also those that are related to, for example, authority, appeals to authorities, such as showing awards. Are there authoritative third-party accolades or partnerships, which can be advertised here in order to borrow authority from another source? Now, zooming out to the broadest level of the framework, when we look at where trust is, I think it's useful to see the category in its broader context. You can see here that trust is going to be made up of all those experiments related to legitimacy, credibility, and security, and all of their constituent sublevers. So a wide set of possible solutions, interventions on the mindset of the user that are going to be relevant to claims made at this level. And you can see then that trust is sitting as one of a suite of 5 possible options, and we'll go into in a minute how efficiently this kind of master lever first solution can help you to sort through this wide range of options, which is intentionally designed to be as comprehensive as we can be in describing the kinds of changes we will want to make to the mindset of a user. So this idea, and I think it's best pitched as you look at the framework, it's the fundamental idea behind the levers framework. It's that there are many ways to interpret and infer from the independent variables of our experiment, and how we phrase that, how we interpret what we're testing and what's meaningful in an experiment is going to have a real bearing on what we're able to learn and what kinds of claims can be evidenced by our experiments. So this is what we're trying to do with the idea of levers generally, trying to describe that level over and above individual executions in a flexible way that applies across different industries and client contexts. But to the levers framework specifically, because it's setting out to define experiments at 3 levels of generality. This assumption that you can reinterpret an independent variable is a built-in part of the design. And we'll look at a little bit about how this can be such a valuable thing throughout the process as we go into the first steps of how we use it in practice. So we'll start, I guess, at the start of an experimentation cycle. I mean, as a cycle, we're going to always be feeding back in, but let's imagine we're starting out an entirely new experimentation program on a new site. One of the first things we're likely to do is try and gather some research and formulate insights or problem statements to understand that website context. We're going to look to be evidence-driven in everything we're doing, so we're not just jumping in and applying best practice. We want to develop that richer understanding of how users think in this specific site context. Examples of the kinds of research that we might use might be things like analytics, scroll or heat maps, user testing and interviews, surveys, all these complementary methods that might tell us different things that we can collect. And critically, the levers framework and how we apply it in the case of insights is going to be agnostic about what these research methods are. And we'll see that as we unpack the research approach that we take at Conversion. So we take an atomic approach, which is based on the idea that we have observations that can come from varied research sources. So user testing and competitor analysis, for example, these are just descriptions of facts, things that happened. User X said Y about the site. 3 out of 4 competitors use this tactic. Our site of study uses this tactic. Clear-cut pieces of data. These are then collated together to form insights, and insights are inferences. They're not just descriptions of things that uncontroversially happened. They're attempts to generalize from those facts. They say, for example, that this website has a problem in terms of user flow. Users are unable to find where specific products are, and so on. They're making claims about other users than just the participants who gave their testimony in research. We then assign an insight with a lever. So given what the insight says, what we understand, what's likely to be an effective way to intervene in the mindset of the user in order to solve this problem or make the most of the opportunity implied by the insight. Now, I think this all becomes a bit more concrete when we look at an actual example. So let's say we were working on this site and we see from a survey that 50% of respondents said that low confidence in the service was a barrier to conversion. We may also have user testing data saying, for example, that 3 of 5 participants shared feedback to the effect of, I'm not familiar with this service, I'm not confident that it will work. Likewise, competitor analysis may be highlighting that competitors' review have a higher social media following, maybe a greater degree of brand recognition in the market. The analytics review may then highlight that users who have had a chance to see the About Us page to see a bit more about the history of the service maybe seem a little more likely to convert on average. If we were to group these together into an insight, and there's a degree of interpretation here, you could rewrite this in lots of different ways. We might say something like, users' lack of trust in the service efficacy is harming conversion. It could be product efficacy. Essentially, users are not getting to the perception we want them to have, which is that we are a reliable service and company, and we're going to do an effective job for you. We can then look to assign that insight a lever based on how we formulated it and the data that's involved. This is likely to be a problem with trust. How trustworthy do you seem as a brand? Digging down a little bit deeper, we might see it as a problem of credibility, specifically as it relates to the idea of competence and efficacy. Are you a reliable and competent brand? And should I believe the motivational claims you're then going to make about the virtues of your product? And finally, we may even go as far as interpreting this as authority. If we look at particularly points related to competitors maybe having greater strength in the market, possibly the fact that people who then become more familiar with your brand and its history tend to be more likely to convert. These things may even push us far enough to actually interpret the sub-lever in this case. What I just went through there is an illustration of what you might call the ad hoc approach or the flexible approach to doing this, whatever your insights and problem statements are and however you formulated them. there's likely to be a good way to assign levers to them, which, as we'll get onto, is going to help you search for a viable solution. But you can also take a more systematic and pre-planned approach to this. We've been working more and more on a kind of battery of questions, if you like, each of which is assigned to a lever. So there are constituent questions that you're looking to answer, and building your research design in order to answer them that's going to ensure that your insights are well formulated in order to inform a lever level analysis. We won't go too much into the specific questions. This is an optional way of approaching it, but I would encourage you, if you are interested, to attend our upcoming subscription company levers benchmarking webinar, where they'll go into a bit more detail about how impactful this approach can be. If you take that more structured approach, you can get to a position where you can give these really nice top line kind of headlines of your key priorities. You can, at a glance, to the extent that you can understand how you rank against competitors along all these key attributes, these lever attributes, start to build a really nice heuristic for, okay, well, where should I focus first? Where might the largest upside be? And relatedly with those competitors, what are they doing that's so effective on this lever? And how can we look to exploit that? You can see there it's on a 1 to 5 scale here, with 5 being best. This also allows you to do breakdowns of analysis by page. So for each lever, where there are relevant questions for that page, for that lever, how well have you performed? And again, we're thinking here about how you build out almost a dashboard of your top line view. How should we set up our initial priorities for ideation, and maybe prioritizing our backlog based on where we can see the biggest opportunity? Again, it doesn't need to rely on having these structured questions. That just allows us to have this more comparable and replicable approach between different practitioners. Ultimately, this kind of point of having a sense of which are your most important insights, however they're ranked, based on levers, is the key thing, and something which will be really valuable as you set out on your strategy. So the action here is clear. Start tagging up your insights or problem statements, however you see them, with levers that are likely to be effective actions in order to maximize the opportunity that's there, and help yourself build up a mental model to prioritize your lever strategy. Can you formulate a nice, even if it's entirely qualitative, top line heuristic that's going to describe what's most important on your site, something that you can communicate with other stakeholders, something which you can use as a reference point in your head? So this carries us nicely on to ideation. We have a good understanding of what's going on the site. Let's look at how we can put that into practice to narrow down the solution space and find some inspiration of what we might be able to do to action these insights. So how does the framework help with ideation? Well, we'll start with an insight that's a similar variation on the insight we saw previously, maybe a little more concise. Users lack confidence in the efficacy of this service. And again, we can look at this kind of parallel process of mapping the insight to a lever, but this time with a focus on how we're finding a path through to an efficient path through to an actionable solution. So what might be an effective way to actually address this problem? And you can see here that when we have the top 5 master levers laid out like that the first step is likely to be, okay, well, which master lever is this going to apply to? And as we discussed before, this idea of a lack of confidence and efficacy is likely to be something to do with trust. But here's the really nice thing. By choosing that master lever, one of only 5 options, you've already eliminated most of the possible lever categories and most of the possible solutions in that space. The ones that weren't as relevant to what you need to do for the experiments that come from that insight. They're already gone through just a really simple selection, which is then repeated at the next stage. So, okay, we think we have a trust problem. Well, let's look at a nice constrained decision between 3 possible options. Is it about legitimacy? Is this such a problem that users maybe don't even think you're a legitimate company? Do you appear to be a scam? Is it about security? We're thinking in terms of how we request kinds of personal and financial information. Most likely this is a problem of credibility. It's more about the efficacy of the service. Does this service actually work? Am I confident that it's competent? So this ultimately is a credibility question. Finally, when you've selected your middle level lever as credibility, you have one final, again, very constrained decision to make. Is it authority? Is it social proof? Is it reassurances? And as we discussed with the data related to maybe a lack of authoritativeness in the industry and that brand strength, we might choose authority here as a relevant lever. Now, what we've gone through there is actually a really efficient way of sorting through what is a very large set of possible solutions, possible ways to understand your problem, and ended up with a really clear-cut understanding and a narrower, easier to sift set of possible solutions. So if you do have an accumulated database of solutions, that's going to really help you with a smaller set of things to look at to see, what's going to work well for this problem. But also, if you're originating an entirely new solution to the problem, you have a sense of what you're trying to achieve. We're trying to appeal to authority in order to elicit a sense of credibility in the user. So two sides to it, the mapping insight side initially being about how do we get a precise formulation of the problem, but the solution searching ideation side of this being how do we narrow the space of possible solutions so we have a clear understanding that points us directly as possible to an actionable solution. And again, the reminder that the backbone of this is the building out these three levels of granularity, the fact that you can redescribe this insight or any given experiment at these different levels and work your way efficiently down through this tree. We call this a vertical shift. So this is when we move from a broad understanding of a problem down to a specific understanding of that problem and a constrained solution space to find our optimal solution. This is another anonymized kind of toy example, but very much based on a real experiment. For this company, they were selling assets for media publishers, and they have a big hobbyist base that are accounting for a lot of the revenue. And the question was, well, can we leverage these associated publishers, the fact that we're trusted by these serious institutions in our industry to do the work that we do well? Can we leverage that in order to persuade more of this wider set of users that we're likely to be a credible company? And finding this solution once you have the idea of authority becomes more straightforward. You just have to ask, what are the authorities in the industry which might resonate with users? So the action here is to use the levers framework to narrow down the possible set of solutions for your problem in line with that similar process of refining your understanding of what the problem is from something broad through the thought experiment and process of thinking through what a more precise understanding of that problem could look like. So this leads us nicely onto experiment analysis. We have some experiments now, we're going to start running them, and we'll look now at that critical thing of how we use A/B tests themselves, such an important source of rigorous data in order to continue to evolve our strategy and learn over time. One of the key points of emphasis of the levers framework. So first, we think about how research provides evidence that a lever will influence user behavior. That was our initial steps when we decided, well, what kind of levers are likely to be important given what we know about the users? You might then go through some initial testing. So you're going to explore the performance of different levers through initial tests. But again, remembering that lever insights develop over multiple executions. They are broader claims than can be conclusively falsified or verified using a single experiment. So in this case, we may see a losing experiment, a winning experiment, and an inconclusive experiment, and still go on to this next generation, knowing that individual experiments may underdetermine what we know about that lever. And in the first case, you can see that the losing experiment has actually produced a fruitful route with 2 winning experiments, a relatively fruitful route from the winner, and the inconclusive ones, not so much. And over time, as we learn more and more about which levers work, we can be more bullish about it. We can invest more in the levers that are working well and double down and increase the complexity of what we're doing to really exploit that value that we know is there. Now, this is kind of hinted at in the path that was tracked out in the previous slide, but we can see in our data that when you're looking at directly iterating on an experiment, so you run experiment 1 and it loses, what do I do for experiment 2? That losers can be even more valuable than winners in telling you what to do next. So thinking about why it is that your experiment didn't work and how it is that you can do the inverse can be a really effective route, especially early on when you're trying to learn from individual experiments before you have that strong aggregate data on what works and what doesn't. And in an extension of the case that we saw earlier, we might start thinking about, well, what if this experiment were to be unsuccessful? What if it were to lose, or what if it were to be inconclusive? What might we make of that lever in light of that? We're asking ourselves, why was this test unsuccessful? And the reason one for failure, again, that's really important to remember is the execution itself. How is it that you operationalize that that lever in this specific experiment. So deploying authority could actually be effective despite our first failure to achieve a winner, but publishers maybe aren't the best way to achieve it. For example, maybe that's not resonating with users. Maybe there's something else wrong with your execution where enough people actually seeing it was it placed in the right place and communicated in the right way. The point is that your strategy will continue to evolve as you learn more about each lever. So you may still go on to run another authority experiment to understand a little bit more over and above that execution, where the value might be, given the initial research evidence you had for a potential problem with authority. However, sometimes things just don't work out. Levers aren't that impactful. It could simply be that there isn't a clear-cut authority that's worth appealing to, or the audience there simply isn't interested in that kind of top-down institution-based credibility. So the data show that users doubted the credibility of the site, and this is a problem. But authority isn't the most effective method for solving this. Social proof is. So we look back at our multiple levels of interpretation based on the initial insights we had and say, well, okay, maybe credibility is still a problem. We've got a lot of data for that. We can make a lateral shift across the framework. The framework is inviting you to consider what other kinds of solutions might be available in the space around social proof. Is that a better way to intervene on the mind of the user? So we may run an experiment there and see that it's successful. And actually, in this case, this is really what happened. After a failed appeal to authority, an iteration was run on which it was repositioned as a kind of credibility stimulus, focusing instead on happy customers, those customers that are more similar to the people who are actually going on to buy, rather than this top-down approach based on those authoritative third parties. This turned out to be effective, with indeed another iteration looking at a similar approach to members of the community behind their customer base. And this kind of approach is going to continue to permeate your strategy as you evolve your understanding of the levers, running more and more experiments and exploring more and more of that lever space, learning about what works and what doesn't to help you prioritize dynamically. But again, remembering that losers can be highly informative and an important part of how you can build up the learnings you need to actually get winners on your way to getting these macro insights. So just a reminder there, and a key action when you're deciding on iterations, you want to review your test results through the lens of the levers framework, remembering that executions can fail even for important levers, and that just because you might want to retire, say, a particular sub-lever, it doesn't mean that the broader construal of the problem isn't sound, and that experiments belonging to that higher order category may not be valuable through a different approach. So finally, through to maybe the most substantial section, and one that I would argue maybe the most important application and the most exciting one that we've had of the levers framework so far. This is meta-analysis and how meta-analysis can help us to learn over and above individual experiments. Now, the key thing here is that as much strength as A/B testing has compared with other ways of working out what might be an optimal thing to implement on a site, and across multiple experiments being a fantastic way to learn about your users. When we're doing A/B testing, we are adopting a scientific method. We're using randomized controlled trials and statistical analysis to make informed decisions. We want to develop a robust understanding of the phenomenon of interest, which typically will be user behavior on our websites of study. But this does mean we need to be really conscious of some of the problems that have been faced in other areas of science concerned with understanding and predicting human behavior, because it really is no secret now that many high-profile findings in psychology and behavioral science have been shown either to be somewhat misguided or else basically entirely false and misleading. So by grouping our experiments together, we're looking to overcome limitations of individual experiments or studies. And it's the same concept, whether you're doing psychology and behavioral science or whether you're doing CRO, whether it's a lever level claim or a psychological theory, they're often just much broader than can be conclusively verified or refuted by an individual experiment. They're underdetermined by the specific context, the executions, or the research design, how you've operationalized it in your experiments. It's just a broader scope of claim than can be licensed. And of course, there's statistical risk associated with any declaration of the outcome of an experiment, but sometimes the execution or research design just simply doesn't quite capture the kinds of claim that we want to make. One fairly high-profile example of this was the concept of grit, a much lauded finding projected into the popular imagination via a TED talk that was given explaining the concept of grit, that is passion and perseverance for long-term goals, as a really strong predictor to increase life success, and some associated claims and work around how interventions on this idea of grit, if you can maximize someone's level of grit, you could improve their life outcomes. And actually some of the meta-analysis here has revealed that these interventions might be quite limited in impact, far perhaps from the strength of the initial claims that were made. So you can see here a quote from some meta-analysis that was conducted looking at replications of the original research. That is, when you repeat that experiment with either the exact same method, or you repeat it in a different context, which should still fall within the scope of the theory. But interventions designed to enhance grit may only have weak effects on performance success, and the construct and validity of grit is in question. Now, there has been some more work done, and the story does look to be fairly nuanced. But I think one thing it really does point to is that the importance of reinterpreting data, being able to reinterpret the independent variable and the data from a given experiment, because it seems like the perseverance component of grit might still be very powerful, but maybe that's doing all the work empirically, and actually the passion side perhaps less so. Something you can only learn through these replications of experiments over time. Similarly, another famous TED Talk, and I won't pick on TED Talks too much, we'll look at another example in a moment. Power poses was something that, again, became fairly viral in the public imagination, this idea that strong open poses can bolster confidence. This, again, has come under controversy, with some replications being unsuccessful. And here, again, the way that individual executions can underdetermine your broader claim is really important, because some of the initial research actually compared open versus closed body language rather than comparing open body language with a neutral control. And it actually seems from some of the replications that were done that the negative poses may just be bad rather than the positive ones being good. So you can see how you might reinterpret the initial research being done as not supporting these positive open poses so much as warning against negative and closed ones. Again, a really important story of how we've gained a much better understanding of the phenomenon via iterative experimentation, and how the initial work may have been misleading. Now, I said I wasn't going to pick on TED Talks, and that's true. I think probably the most egregious cases of this are arguably some of the more influential findings in psychology and behavioral science over the last few decades. One really prominent example is some of the work on priming popularized by Kahneman. So the idea of priming is that these small behavioral or language cues can lead to substantial changes, often unintuitive and interesting changes in people's behavior. One very famous example of priming was the idea that someone could read an excerpt of text containing words that were associated with elderly people and then go on to leave the room at a slower pace. In 2011, Kahneman wrote, "The results are not made up, nor are they statistical flukes. You have no choice but to accept that the major conclusions of these priming studies are true." And as soon as 2012 had to concede the experimental evidence for the ideas he presented in that chapter were, quote, significantly weaker than he believed when he wrote it. And this is just one part of a much bigger problem in academic psychology, is people have been going to replicate seemingly influential and sound studies. They're finding that, in fact, a lot of this work doesn't work. When it's subjected to meta-analysis over broader sets of contexts, repetitions of the experiment, it just doesn't hold up as the initial theories predicted. And in some fields of psychology, this is getting particularly bad. There are estimates as low as 25% or even lower for social psychology. And while the replicability rate of different fields of psychology does vary, they tend to be less than 50%. Less than 50% of findings from initially impressive and successful looking experiments are going on to actually be replicated in later experiments and holding up to that scrutiny of meta-analysis. And our work to understand user behavior through science is not going to be exempt from these problems. And levers are really important because they provide us with a consistent vocabulary and set of concepts to describe experiments in a way which can help us learn with that robustness over time. But like any broader themes of experimentation, over and above just descriptions of individual implementations, lever level claims are have a larger burden of proof, right? Because they operate over multiple executions, they require multiple executions in order to accumulate strong evidence. We simply can't have a claim of the broader sort, like credibility stimulus is a key way to alter user behavior for companies with a subscription model, or even really for a specific company, be accepted or rejected based on the results of just one A/B test. So to illustrate how this might play out in practice, you could see in your initial credibility experiment that it's unsuccessful. You have 0 of 1 and a 0% win rate. In the next generation of these experiments, you run another one and you find a winner, a 50% win rate. But over time, as you build up your sample of these experiments, you get a better and better estimate of how powerful credibility might be. And in fact, in this case, it looks like you've substantially underestimated it and missed that opportunity to double down and increase complexity. This has been a really fruitful process for us as we go through our internal experimentation programs, comparing success of different levers. So here we have a real example of some experiment data that's been gathered at, pretty realistic and attainable levels. Each experiment has, you can see there, between 6 and 10 experiments that have been run under it. So it's not perfect data, but by grouping them together, we're starting to get a better sense of what the win rate might be for each of those categories and what the average winning uplift is likely to be. And then with one nice metric that merges these, you can multiply the win rate by the average uplift of experiments that win in that category to see the expected impact. And you may see there that product understanding, for example, has a substantially higher expected impact than benefits, despite having fewer experiments run under it, perhaps an underexploited lever and something that you can go on to then prioritize. And one really important thing when we're talking about taking up the levers framework for an existing CRO program is that we've seen real success retroactively recategorizing experiments under the levers framework. So taking the old ways that we were describing our independent variables and reinterpreting them under the levers framework to achieve some real impact. And in this example, this is taken from a client program in which I believe they hit their annual revenue goal in the first quarter after recategorizing their experiments. They just found so much missed opportunities, such interesting insights from their recategorization process. So it's definitely never too late to start on this. We can also start to generate, when we have multiple kinds of sites across different industries, these macro level insights, which can be really interesting. And perhaps if we'd had this macro insight that social proof on the whole outperforms authority when we're going through our initial ideation task, we might have thought, well, is social proof likely to be the better solution before we even run our first experiment? A similar head start might be achieved by looking at other kinds of industry level macro data, for example, contrasting not-for-profit versus retail experiments and seeing that while motivation, trust, and usability may behave in relatively similar ways, comprehension-based experiments and cost experiments behave very differently indeed. And this, again, can give you a real head start into understanding what kinds of experiments you should prioritize. So over time, the levers framework is helping us to uncover the extent to which our learnings are generalizable. What is the scope of them? Where do levers work and where do they not work? To what extent should we double down on and prioritize these things? We're learning over time and developing a more robust understanding of our users and of CRO more broadly. The action here would just be to start a process where you tag new experiments. This could be as simple as a Google Sheet in which you have the name of the experiment, the outcome of it, and a lever. And just that simple thing, as you start to scale it up, might tell you really interesting things that you may have missed about what's working and what's not working in your strategy. Critically, though, at regular intervals, you should conduct a little meta-analysis to see what that data is. You may not be in the habit day to day. While you may look at individual experiment results and how to iterate, you need to remember to look at that macro data as it evolves and be agile in the way you approach your strategy. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about confidence AI, because this is really where we push the boundaries on this further. Obviously, there are lots of things, as we discussed at the start, that could be important considerations when you're thinking about how to describe what's important in an experiment, right? Different ways you might describe the independent variable or reasons that it won. So in our original example, yes, we were boosting credibility via social proof. We were also experimenting on a homepage, placing new content above the fold, testing in whatever industry we're testing in, and trying to elicit subscriptions rather than one-off purchases. It's a lot of segmenting of data, a lot of narrowing down, lots of considerations. It's going to be a difficult manual task. So we've started leveraging machine learning like Confidence AI in order to incorporate all of these parameters: the lever and industry, the position, the audience, the page, along with psychological principles and so on, in order to render stronger predictions. And we do this all just through a simple tagging system. The same thing we're talking about with levers, just scaled up across different attributes we can use to describe an experiment. It can be very simple and very intuitive, but it just works well on aggregate. And this confidence AI technology is helping us to generate really powerful predictions, and the early data is looking really promising. So here you can see that where confidence AI gives your experiment a rating between 67 and 100, this experiment has a 63% chance of winning. Between 34 and 66, a 43% chance of winning, and 0 and 33, a 27% chance. So already there are signs that our model is managing to become pretty well calibrated. And actually, if you take the 67 to 100 category, but potentially able to substantially outpredict a practitioner in CRO based on estimates of standard industry win rates. The combination of lever and industry is absolutely fundamental to this. It does most of the predictive work in this model. And I think in a way, the fact that it's so heavily exploited in this model to such predictive success might be the most important validation of the underlying soundness of this framework. And you can get some really interesting data out of it once you start segmenting by industry as well. So this combination of these industry and lever dynamics when they interact seems to be something that's really powerful indeed. We are looking to go further than this by introducing kinds of automated feature identification. So how high is the visual contrast of a new design, or what's the tone of the copy as identified by OpenAI, copy complexity, how familiar is the overall design approach, and things that I think are going to push this even further to become an increasingly powerful tool to leverage our large and growing data set to be able to predict the outcome of an experiment with increasingly impressive accuracy. Now, that all sounds very lofty, very substantial, and future-facing, but it all starts in a really simple place. And that is just the maybe mundane and laborious task of going through and tagging up your experiments. But I would really impress upon you that if you just start with a simple thing of tagging up levers and then follow it up with the kinds of intuitive things that maybe are already in your data set. Where did you run the experiment? What audience did you run it on? What KPIs was it impacting? You can start to build up really powerful insights really quickly for specific programs, and then even a database capable of predicting experiment outcomes better than people. I don't want to assume that this is going to be really easy. So just a quick thing before I leave this, I wanted to give a couple of clarifications that might help you as you set out to recategorize your program under the levers framework. One thing to always bear in mind is that when you're tagging experiments and describing the independent variable, you want to be describing the difference between the variation and control. Ultimately, if you stack the lever tagging up against outcomes, that outcome data is going to be telling you about the difference, right? Did it win or not? Is a reflection of the change that the variation made against the control. So in this case, while in both cases we're talking about something relevant to product understanding, it's a pizza with pepperoni, cheese, and tomato sauce. In the variation, we're adding in more evocative language, which I think is much more motivation-based, getting people to anticipate how delicious the food will be. Sizzling pepperoni, indulgent cheese, homely tomato sauce. So while both are in the area that product understanding happens, if you like, the difference between the variation and control, the thing that's changing, the independent variable, is about what I would say is likely to be benefits content. Ultimately, what's the upside of this pizza? Relatedly, here we have an experiment where the control and variation share step 1 and step 4, so the home page, and then a page where you're going to choose what goes into your recipe kit for this recipe kit service. Now, in the middle 2 steps that are being inserted by the variation, we're making a substantial change to the user flow. It may even substantially increase the amount of effort that's involved in this experiment. But the question you need to ask yourself when you've got a mix of possible changes that are inevitably happening is, if this experiment were to win, what would be the main reason that it would win? So the thing that this experiment is trying to achieve, which will ultimately inform whether or not it wins, and therefore what's relevant to our win rate data, is motivation driven. I think benefits driven. It's getting people to read about how the recipes are flexible, they're easy to follow, they have amazing meals and all this variety. So again, thinking in terms of, if this experiment were to win, what would be the main reason that it would win? One key takeaway that I'll leave you with before we can go through and take some questions is just start by tagging levers. Say we went through some of the exciting stuff that we're doing and all the upside and potential that's there in this work, but it really starts with that simple thing of tagging. Even if it's just a Google sheet, these categories are now well supported. They seem to be really effective at leveraging good predictions, better strategic insights. Tag them up with these categories and you'll start to see value coming quite quickly. I'm confident. One last thing to mention is just that, as I referred to before, we have a subscription benchmarking webinar coming up where we'll go through some subscription brands and the challenges that they're facing. I believe it's Netflix, Spotify, Kiwico, HelloFresh, and Headspace. So a nice bit of variability in terms of value propositions, but all underpinned by how they approach this common problem of subscriptions. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested in taking a more systematic approach to linking research to levers to then feed through your strategy, I think this will be an interesting one. So thank you very much. That's everything from me. Do we have any questions?
Thanks, Ed. That was brilliant. So yes, we do have a couple of questions that have come in. So the first one is, when do you decide that you've tested enough and you've gotten the most out of your current lever? So I suppose with this one, I guess we're talking about partly whether you're going to see diminishing returns. You may have other levers that start to drive bigger returns, so you prioritize these once you have a lever that's you're starting to see not perform as highly. But having said that, lever performance can easily stay really, really strong when there are so many opportunities to exploit across areas. You know, if you may start out with a winner on a certain page, and there's so many different ways you can exploit that by across the site, but also in terms of more advanced executions, scaling up your executions and the way you're doing things from copy, functionality, etc. So we have data showing that even when we're at sort of 20 plus experiments on a certain lever, the win rate for that lever can still be as strong as it was at the start, which is really interesting data. So you won't necessarily hit that moment when you're seeing diminishing returns, but if you did, then that would be the moment when you might start thinking, you know, are there other levers that are more worthwhile exploiting? It's all about how much value you're going to get from one lever compared to another, essentially, in terms of win rate and the scale, the size of the uplift that it's generating, or the overall revenue value it's driving. Would you add anything to that, Ed?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great response. I guess I would add that you could look at mapping your lever progress kind of more over time. So we looked more at the kind of static views of it, you know, on aggregate, how well has it been performing? But if you were to instead plot out the uplifts of the experiments that were there, and if you have a large enough number of them that you're facing diminishing returns, you may actually be able to start picking up some of the trends that are there. But of course, website isn't a static thing. New opportunities to do it might come up, and it may just be a matter of getting creative over and above those executions. But yeah, that mapping of uplifts over time, including the maybe just using the observed uplifts to include, you know, indicative negative ones and so on, how well is it working over time, could be an interesting approach. But I would also say maybe if you have comparable research methods, so if you're benchmarking with surveys, that could be another thing. So if surveys initially informed why you're approaching that lever, then it could be that further down the road, you want to repeat that same method and see, you know, do you see substantial differences based on the new audiences who are there, or based on you actually having solved the problem? That could be another way to help. But it's definitely a really interesting question, and one that we could spend, I think, more time discussing and investigating.
Nice. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point around the fact that the website isn't static. So you could see performance of the lever drop, and then ultimately 6 months down the line, something in the industry could change that brings that lever back up in terms of performance, for example. Cool. And then another question we have is, which specific use cases would you say we're likely to see the most value from straight away?
It's difficult to say outright, because it depends on whether you could have loads of insights and not many experiments. But let's say you've got lots of experiments and lots of insights. I would start with the experiments themselves. As I say, it's been through the meta-analysis that we've seen the most power generated by this. But of course, if you are having a really difficult time going from your insights through to those actionable solutions, that could be a similar priority. But yeah, generically, I would say, assuming you've got a good amount of data for both, it's going to be that experiment meta-analysis that we've seen the most interest from and power from so far.
Absolutely. Another question that's come in is around whether we can share broad patterns of master levers or the levers or sub-levers across industries. So we have shared some of these patterns on our company LinkedIn page already, so I'd point you there, but we're definitely keen to share some more comprehensive data soon. So that would be shared via our newsletter and on socials. So please sign up to those if you're interested. Another question, I think on a similar note, just scanning through, do you have a lever tree showing all of the levers you have tagged so far in your experimentation? So I think that might be referring that there's the overall lever tree that again can be found on our socials and in the white paper that we'll share on the link afterwards. So that shows the general tree, and then for any sort of data that's personal to our own sort of database, yeah, like I say, we'll share that on the on socials and newsletter. Another question that's come in is when testing different executions within the lever, would you suggest a multivariate test or an ABCD, etc. test for those executions, or always a series of A/B tests?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really interesting question. So I left just the levers framework as it is there in case it's useful as a reference point now. So yeah, this is a really interesting question when we talk about how we almost expect, regardless of the outcome of our initial experiment, to run another iteration anyway. And I think there's a really strong case to be made that given that investment is going to be there regardless, unless there are particular reasons that you need to kind of resource move, that you might look at doing that as part of the initial experiment to understand potentially faster and with that kind of added efficiency of how you're allocating traffic between a control and two variations. Yeah, I think that could be a good way to go, and one that I think we should look at more and more. A conversion on the UK side, I think there could be real value there. That question, it comes down to a deeper question, right? Which is how much should you, how conservatively should you explore the lever space or the solution space? Do you need each experiment result before you consider investing in another one? I think there's a really interesting question there to be answered more broadly. How fast should you look to explore? Should you try and go through one lever all the way down to 5 experiments before you explore the next one? What's that breadth of approach? But given what we discussed there around how limited the insights from an individual experiment are for the fate of that lever and the kind of claims that you might want to make, yeah, I think there could be real strength in taking that first step.
Nice, yeah, absolutely. And then on the more practical side, it's just down to, do you have enough traffic to do it? Because the most important thing is to get valuable insights for each of those levers. If we the risk of getting lots of inconclusive data for levers will leave us with obviously none the wiser. So that's sort of the number one practical consideration, to make sure you're actually going to get those valuable insights out of the lever framework. Another question that's come in is around sort of the practical application of Confidence AI in our day-to-day work. So how do you actually employ Confidence AI to build out a roadmap for a program?
Yeah, so the main way that we've been using Confidence AI so far is part of prioritization framework. So we'll go through some steps of ideation. We'll come up with a backlog of experiments that we might want to run. That means that we know what those features of the experiment actually are that are going to match up to the parameters going into the model. So we'll know where the experiment's running, what lever it's under, what kind of components it's working with, and all those myriad things that we showed before that are feeding into it. So because they're generating those predictions for a specific experiment relies on having that data, generally is being used for prioritization once we have a sense of what those experiments could look like on those key criteria.
Nice. Thank you, Ed. We've got 1 minute to spare, so we'll stop there with the questions. But thank you for all of those. Really great to have you send those in. And everyone will receive a recording of this webinar in your emails. And we'll share the link to the white paper on the competitor benchmarking as well. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, everyone.